My name is Amber Collins. I am 35 years old. I am a lecturer in the Department of English at Arizona State University in Phoenix, where I have taught composition and literature for the past 7 years. I teach my students to make arguments. I teach them to gather evidence and structure it and present it clearly, without overreaching what the evidence supports, and to let the argument do the work rather than the emotion. I am going to try to do that now. I am going to try to tell this story the way I teach my students, specifically, accurately, and without asking for more sympathy than the facts themselves produce. The facts produce enough. In March, 2 years ago, I was diagnosed with stage 2 breast cancer. I was 34 years old. The oncologist who gave me the diagnosis, Dr. Patricia Nguyen at Banner Anderson Cancer Center in Phoenix, told me the treatment plan would involve 8 cycles of chemotherapy, followed by surgery, followed by radiation. She told me the prognosis was good. She told me that good meant what it meant in oncology, which is not certain but is substantially in my favor, and that the treatment would be hard, but that I was otherwise healthy, and that my body had the resources to get through it. She was right that it was hard. She was right that I had the resources. Cycles. 32 weeks. I lost my hair at week 3 and did not get it back until week 29, and in the weeks between I wore a head covering, a soft cotton wrap in a deep burgundy that my colleague Dr. Reyes had given me, because she had been through her own version of this 5 years before and knew things about being a woman without hair in a professional environment that I did not yet know. I wore it to my classes. I wore it to the grocery store. I wore it in the infusion chair 45 minutes twice a week, watching the medication move through the IV line at my forearm. I got through it. I want you to know that before I tell you the rest, I am on the other side. I am here. The cancer is gone. What I want to tell you about is not the cancer, though the cancer is the context. What I want to tell you about is my sister Tammy, who I asked in the most vulnerable 8 months of my life to help our elderly parents understand what was happening to me, and who chose, instead, to use those 8 months, my treatment, my hair loss, my fear, my weakness, as an opportunity to rebuild the family narrative in a way that made her the capable one and me the cautionary tale. The diagnosis arrived on a Thursday in March. I had gone in for a follow-up on something that had initially seemed minor. A lump I had found during a routine self-examination that my primary care physician had referred for imaging, and then for biopsy, with the measured language of someone who is not yet alarmed, but who is being careful. The biopsy results came back on a Thursday, and Dr. Nguyen called me herself, rather than having the office call, which told me something before she said a word. She told me clearly and completely. I had been a student and then a teacher long enough to know that what I needed in a moment like that was information, complete and accurate. Not information filtered through someone else's assessment of what I could handle. Dr. Nguyen seemed to understand this. She gave me the pathology results, the staging, the treatment plan, the prognosis, and then she gave me a few minutes while I sat with it. And then she answered every question I had. There were a lot of questions. She answered all of them. I drove home from that appointment on the I-10 in rush hour Phoenix traffic, which takes approximately 45 minutes on a bad afternoon, and have very little recollection of that drive. I know I did not cry. I know I had the radio on. I know at some point during drive I started making a list in my head, not a grief list, a logistics list. Needed to happen. Who needed to be told. How to structure the next 8 months so that my teaching schedule, my treatment schedule, and parents' peace of mind could all be managed as simultaneously as possible. This is how I cope. I make lists. I structure things. It is the academic's reflex. When reality becomes unmanageable, impose a framework on it. The framework had 3 components: my work, my treatment, and my parents. My parents are Robert and Diane Collins, both in their mid-70s, living in Scottsdale in the house they have been in for 22 years. My father had a minor stroke the previous year. Not debilitating, his recovery had been good. But it had left him with the specific vulnerability of a man who has been reminded that his body is not as reliable as he had always assumed. My mother managed her own anxiety about this with careful attention to routine and with the particular vigilance that comes from loving someone who has been unwell. They were, in the spring of my diagnosis, a couple who were managing things, but who were managing things with care. They did not need an additional large stress without support. I knew I had to tell them. Of course I had to tell them. I am their daughter and I had cancer, and telling them was not optional. But how I told them, and what information they had, and how the ongoing reality of my treatment was communicated to them, these things mattered. I did not want my elderly father, still in the aftermath of his stroke, to spend 8 months in acute fear. I did not want my mother's managed anxiety to become unmanageable. I wanted them to have the truth accurately and in context, without the panic that truth, without context, can produce. This is why I called Tammy. Tammy is my older sister, 39 years old, 4 years my senior. Living in Scottsdale near my parents in a house she bought 3 years ago after divorce. She works in insurance. She is organized and practical, and has always had, in the way of certain older siblings, a functional relationship with our parents that is built on regular contact and practical assistance. She drives my father to appointments when he needs it. She has dinner with my mother on Sundays. She is physically present in their lives in a way that I, living 45 minutes away in Phoenix, am slightly less present. I called Tammy the Thursday evening of the diagnosis. She came to my apartment. We sat at my kitchen table, and I told her what I knew with the same completeness I preferred to receive information with. I told her the staging, the treatment plan, the prognosis. I told her I was going to be okay. I told her it was going to be hard. She held my hand across the kitchen table. She cried. She said, "Tell me what you need." Robert and Diane Collins met in 1971 at a community college in Tucson, Arizona, where they were both taking evening classes while working during the day. My father was studying accounting and my mother was studying nursing, and they met in a shared statistics class that neither of them remembers with particular affection, but that they have, for 50-plus years, acknowledged as the most important class either of them ever took. They married in 1973 and had Tammy in 1985 and me in 1989. Which means there was a gap of 12 years between their marriage and their first child that I have never fully understood and that they have never fully explained, and I have decided to accept this as one of those facts of family history that are yours to hold, not necessarily yours to know the reasons for. What I know is that by the time Tammy was born, and by the time I was born, they were people who had been through things and were on the other side of them, and the people they were as parents were shaped by that. They were patient. They were warm. They had a quality of steadiness, not complacency, steadiness that I found, growing up, enormously reassuring. My father retired from his accounting firm 8 years ago. He has spent his retirement doing things he did not have time for during his career. Woodworking, which has produced a number of objects of varying quality that fill their Scottsdale house, and a community garden plot that he tends with the specific devotion of someone who has found, late in life, the activity, always the right one. He is a quiet man who expresses affection through action. He brings things, he fixes things, he shows up. The stroke the previous year had frightened all of us. His recovery had been good, but the fear remained. My mother Diane was a pediatric nurse for 31 years before she retired. She spent her career in circumstances that required calm under pressure, which means that she has an exceptional capacity for managing acute stress and a somewhat lower capacity for chronic uncertainty. She can handle bad news if the bad news is specific and actionable. What she struggles with is not knowing, the extended uncertainty of a situation that does not resolve quickly. For this reason, specifically, that I wanted Tammy to be the bridge, because I knew my treatment would be long, and that the uncertainty would be protracted, and that having someone on the ground, someone who could provide regular calm updates, was the way to keep my mother's anxiety from becoming its own crisis. Tammy grew up in the same household I did. She knew our parents the same way I knew them. She knew my father's vulnerability since the stroke. She knew my mother's relationship with uncertainty. When I called her and asked her to be the bridge, I was not giving her abstract instructions. I was asking someone who shared my full understanding of the situation to do a specific and important job. She said she would. I want to give you a picture of who Tammy is before I tell you what she did, because understanding what she did requires understanding the person who did it. Tammy has always been the older one in the way that some older siblings are the older one. Not simply because of birth order, because she has always positioned herself as the one who has figured things out first, the one who has experience to offer, the one who is slightly ahead. When I was in high school and she was in college, she offered advice on navigating the social politics of high school from the position of someone who had survived it. When I was in college and she was in her mid-20s, she offered advice on managing adult life from the position of someone who was managing it. This was often genuine and sometimes useful, but underneath the advising and underneath the positioning as the one who had things figured out, there was something that I had always known was there and had always chosen not to examine too carefully. Tammy needed to be needed. She needed to be the one our parents called. She needed to be the one who was managing things. She had built her identity in our family, partly on being the reliable one, the capable one, the one who showed up. I want to be precise about Tammy, the way I am precise about things I have thought about carefully. Because she is my sister, and I have loved her for 35 years, and she is not a monster, and this story is not well served by making her one. She is a complicated person who did a specific and harmful thing in a moment when the easier choice, the right choice, was available to her, and she did not take it. That is the honest characterization. Tammy has always been organized, and her organization has always been in the service of managing other people's impressions of her. Her house is immaculate not entirely because she values cleanliness, though she does, but because she understands that a well-kept house is a social statement. She is always professionally dressed, not entirely because she values appearance, though she does, but because she understands that appearance communicates competence before a word is spoken. She manages the perception of herself carefully and consistently, and she has done so for long enough that the management has become, I think, mostly unconscious. She is no longer performing capable. She is, in her own mind, simply being it. The divorce, 3 years before my diagnosis, was a hard thing for Tammy. Not because she had loved her husband in the deep way of a relationship that sustains. I do not think the marriage had been that for years. Because divorce is a public rearrangement of identity, and identity was what Tammy was most invested in. She had been half of a marriage. She was now alone. She handled it by intensifying her investment in the other relationships that defined her friendships, her work, and most significantly, her relationship with our parents. After the divorce, she moved to Scottsdale, which put her 7 minutes from our parents' house. She became the daughter who was there. Sun dinners, weekday errands, the physical presence that I could not provide from 45 minutes away. She became, in the years between her divorce and my diagnosis, the person our parents relied on most. This was a real and genuine thing she gave them, and I do not minimize it. She showed up. She was present. She earned the position she held. What she had also built, in those years, was a narrative about the comparative positions of her and me in the family, not explicitly, not in any conversation that could be quoted, but in the accumulated small communications of daily proximity, who our parents called, who they relied on, who understood them. The narrative was, Tammy is here. Tammy is stable. Tammy is the one who manages things. Amber is wonderful. Amber is accomplished. Amber has her life in Phoenix. But Tammy is here. This narrative was, I want to be clear, largely accurate. She was here. She was stable. She did manage things. The problem was not that the narrative was false. The problem was what she did when my diagnosis threatened to displace it. Cancer does not leave room for carefully managed narratives about who is the capable sibling. Cancer requires that the attention go where the need is. My diagnosis made me the center of the family's attention and concern in a way that was completely out of my control and not of my choosing, and it put Tammy in a position she had not been in since before her divorce. The position of the sibling who is not the primary focus. I believe, and this is my analysis, not her confession, that Tammy could not hold that position. Not because she is evil, because the identity she had built required her to be the capable one, and my illness, handled well, would have made her one supporting character in my story. And she did not want to be a supporting character. She wanted to be the protagonist. So she rewrote the story. I want to be specific about what I asked Tammy to do, because specificity matters here. I did not ask her for interpretation. I did not ask her to mediate my relationship with my parents, or to offer her analysis of my situation. I asked her for something concrete: communication. The Friday after my diagnosis, I had a conversation with her at my apartment in Phoenix. She had come over after work, and we sat in my kitchen again, and I gave her the information I wanted communicated to our parents, and asked her to communicate it. I had written it down, because I am an academic and I write things down, and I gave her the paper. I still have the original. It is on a yellow legal pad in my handwriting, and it says, what to tell mom and dad. Breast cancer, stage 2. It is 8 cycles of chemo at Banner MD Anderson in Phoenix. Prognosis is good. This means the cancer is likely to respond well to treatment. Treatment starts in 2 weeks and runs through November. Dr. Nguyen, excellent. I am going to be okay. The treatment will be tired. I will likely lose my hair. I will have some rough weeks. I will keep them updated. They do not need to come to treatment. I have a support system in place, and I will let them know if that changes. The most helpful thing they can do is trust that I have this handled and not add their worry to my load. That was what I asked Tammy to communicate. Accurate, specific, framed to minimize catastrophizing. The prognosis is good. I am going to be okay. Do not add your worry to my load. She said, take care of it. I said, I need you to use my words, Tammy. Not an interpretation. My words. Of course. I know how to talk to them. Over the following 2 weeks, before my treatment began, I talked to my parents twice. My mother called me on the Sunday after Tammy had presumably communicated the information. She sounded not calm. She is mother, and I had cancer. But she sounded like someone who had received specific information and was processing it rather than someone who was catastrophizing. She asked good questions. She asked about Dr. Nguyen. She asked about the treatment center. She asked if I needed anything. This was my mother, the nurse response, practical, directed, information-seeking. It was appropriate. It told me that Tammy had communicated the information correctly. My father called 2 days later. He was quieter. My father is always quieter than my mother. He said, "I'm proud of you for handling this." He said it with the specific weight of a father who is frightened and is trying to express that without adding his fear to mine. I told him I was going to be okay. He said, "I know you are." He said it the way people say things they want to be true rather than things they know to be true, and I loved him for it. Those first 2 calls were what I had hoped for. My parents had been told. They were frightened but not panicking. The bridge was working. I started treatment on a Monday morning in late March. Tammy drove to my first infusion. I had told her she didn't need to. She insisted, and I accepted. Because having someone there for the first one seemed reasonable. She sat in the waiting room while I was in the infusion chair. Afterward, she drove me home and made me tea and stayed until I fell asleep. This is the part of this story that I think about when I'm in danger of simplifying Tammy into something she is not. She drove me to treatment. She made me tea. In the first week, she was what she had promised to be. The doing it wrong part came afterward. Gradually. While I was too sick to notice. I did not understand the question about staying out late. I told my mother that I had not left my apartment in 5 days, that I was in the middle of a treatment cycle and going out was not something I was capable of, let alone something I was doing. She said, "Oh, I must have misunderstood what Tammy said." She moved on. I held the question. I am a person who makes notes. I opened the Notes app on my phone, and I typed. Mom said Tammy said I was staying out late. Week 4 of treatment. I was at home for the last 5 days. I saved it, and I kept going. At week 6, my father called and asked, carefully and with the evident anxiety of someone who has been worried about something for several days, "Is everything okay, Amber? Are you being careful?" I asked what he meant by careful. There was a pause. He said, "Tammy mentioned something about you making some choices that were hard on your body, and we want you to know you can talk to us." I asked him specifically what choices he had been told I was making. He said he didn't know specifics. Tammy had just expressed concern. Making choices that were hard on my body. I was chemotherapy. The only choice I was making that was hard on was allowing a medical team to administer a treatment that was keeping me alive. I wrote it down. Kept going. At week 8, my mother asked me, with the careful diplomacy of someone has been given information they do not know how to raise directly, whether I was in any kind of trouble. Not medical trouble. I was clearly in medical trouble. That was not the question. Something else. She said Tammy had mentioned she was worried, that she thought I was struggling in ways that went beyond the cancer. I asked my mother to tell me exactly what Tammy had said. My mother, who was trying to be loyal to both of her daughters simultaneously and succeeding at neither, said. She said she thought some of the choices you made before the diagnosis might have contributed to what happened, that she was worried about you even before you got sick. Choices that contributed. This is the phrase I want to sit with for a moment, because it is the most specific piece of what Tammy was doing and the most revealing. Can't is not caused by choices. I want to say this with complete directness. Breast cancer is not caused by lifestyle choices in the way that phrase implies. My oncologist had been clear about this. The type I had was hormone receptor positive, which has a known pathology that is not related to behaviors that phrase, choices that contributed, implies. Tammy knew this. She had been told the specifics of my diagnosis. She had been in my kitchen when I explained them. The claim that my choices had contributed was not a medically uninformed one. It was a deliberately misleading one. She was telling my elderly parents, who did not have the medical sophistication to evaluate the claim, that their daughter's cancer was somehow her own fault. She was doing this with enough plausible deniability to a direct accusation. Not Amber did this to herself, but I wonder if some of her choices contributed. She was planting the seed without growing the plant herself, and she was doing it while positioning herself as the worried, responsible sister, the one who was telling our parents the hard truths that Amber was not being open about, the one they should trust. I continued making notes. By week 10, I had 7 entries, each one a specific instance of something my parents had said that was inconsistent with accurate information about my illness and treatment. I had not yet understood the picture. I was still at week 10, in treatment. I was still exhausted. I was still sick. I was running the cognitive process of understanding what was happening to me in the background, while the foreground was occupied by the work of staying alive, teaching, and getting to the next infusion. I want to give you the full picture of the questions before I tell you about Nurse Deborah, because the questions and evidence should be presented in sequence. Over 12 weeks of treatment, my parents had asked me whether I was getting enough sleep, whether I was being careful, whether I was in any kind of trouble, whether there was something I wasn't telling them, whether I had talked to a therapist not about the cancer but about other things, whether I was eating properly, whether I had been honest with my doctors about everything, whether I needed to come to Phoenix not to support me through treatment because they were worried about me in general. Every one of these questions was inconsistent with what they should have known. They should have known I was sleeping as much as possible, because chemotherapy fatigue is a documented and significant symptom that I had explained to Tammy in detail and that Tammy had been present for on the days she visited. They should have known there was no trouble beyond the medical kind. They should have known there was nothing I wasn't telling them, because I had given Tammy a detailed, written account of what I was dealing with and asked her to relay it. Instead, they were asking questions that only made sense if the picture they had been given was a different one, a picture where Amber was in some kind of generalized difficulty that extended beyond a cancer diagnosis, where her choices, unspecified, implicitly irresponsible, had contributed to her situation, a picture where Tammy was the reliable daughter trying to manage a complicated situation with an uncooperative sister. I added each question to my notes. The list was 11 items by week 12. I was also, by week 12, beginning to have direct conversations with Tammy that were revealing in their own way. When I asked her how her conversations with our parents were going, she said, "They're worried, obviously." I tried to reassure them. When I asked what specifically she was reassuring them about, she said, "Just general worry. You know how they are." When I said that my mother had asked me about choices I had made and whether they contributed to my illness, and asked Tammy if she had any idea where it had come from, Tammy, I might have mentioned that stress can affect immune function. I was just trying to give them context. Stress affects immune function, a medically accurate general statement deployed in a context where it functions as a suggestion that my stress, resulting from my unspecified bad choices, had contributed to my cancer. She was very good at this. The language was always defensible. The implication was never defensible. I said, "Tammy, I need you to stop talking to our parents about the causes of my illness. The cause of my illness is cancer. It is not stress. It is not choices. I need you to relay the information I give you accurately and nothing else. I'm just trying to help them understand. I said, "You are helping them misunderstand." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I think you're being a little sensitive, Amber. I know you're going through a hard time." Deborah Weston has been an oncology nurse for 19 years. She has been at Banner MD Anderson for 11 of those years, on the infusion unit. And she has the specific quality that the best oncology nurses develop over careers spent in proximity to the most difficult human experiences. She is simultaneously warm and unshockable. She has seen things that would break most people, and she continues to show up with care and without theater. I know these things about Deborah because she told them to me later when we talked. On the tune question, she was not a character in my story yet. She was simply a nurse doing her rounds, moving a supply cart down the hallway that ran alongside the small family waiting room adjacent to my infusion bay. The waiting room has a door that is generally left ajar. Tammy was inside with the door not fully closed. She was on the phone. Deborah told me afterward that she heard enough of the conversation to understand what was being described and to whom. She heard Tammy on the phone with someone she addressed as Dad, my father. She heard Tammy describe my situation in terms that were, by any clinical standard, inaccurate. She heard the phrase "in trouble" before this started. She heard something about choices. She heard Tammy's voice adopt the specific register of concerned authority that she had, apparently, been performing for my parents for 12 weeks. Deborah is a nurse. She works in an environment where the protection of patients and their families from misinformation about illness is a professional obligation. She is also a human being who has spent 19 years watching what families do to each other in the presence has developed. Over those years, a particular intolerance for the weaponization of medical vulnerability. She finished her supply cart duties. She walked to the nursing station. She charged nurse and described what she had heard. The charge nurse walked to the office of the floor's patient social worker, a woman named Linda Baxter, who had been in that position for 8 years and who, like Deborah, had spent a career in the proximity of families under pressure. Linda Baxter's role, among other things, is to identify and address family dynamics that are affecting a patient's care environment. A family member who is providing inaccurate information to a patient's primary support network about the nature of the patient's illness, in the clinical language of her role, a psychosocial risker for the patient. I did not know any of this was happening. I was in the infusion chair for 45 minutes while Tammy was in the waiting room on the phone. I came out to find her scrolling her phone with the particular studied casualness of someone who has recently been doing something they are not going to mention. She drove me home. She made tea. She left. That evening, Linda Baxter called my parents. Linda Baxter called my parents on a Tuesday evening. She had called with the stated purpose of a check-in, but the actual purpose, which she was transparent about, eventually, because a professional who does not believe in pretending things are other than what they are, was to assess what they had been told and to correct the record if was needed. What she found in that initial call was a set of misunderstandings significant enough that she asked if they would be willing to come to Phoenix the following week for a family meeting with herself, and if I was agreeable, my oncologist. She framed it as routine, a family support meeting that was sometimes helpful at the midpoint of treatment. She did not yet tell them that the misunderstandings they had been operating under were not accidental. My parents said yes, drove from Scottsdale to Phoenix the following Thursday. I was not told about the meeting until Linda Baxter called me the day before and explained what she wanted to do. She told me, at that point, about what Deborah had overheard. She told me she had spoken with my parents, and that the information they had been given about my illness was significantly inaccurate. She told me she thought it would be important for them to receive accurate information directly, and she asked for my permission to facilitate that. I said yes. I said it with the specific relief of someone who has been carrying an additional weight during treatment, the weight of knowing something was wrong but being too sick to address it, and has just been told that someone else is going to carry it for a moment. I did not attend the Thursday meeting. Linda Baxter had suggested I not be there for the first part, that she meet with my parents and Dr. Nguyen without me so that the information could be given without my presence, creating an emotional variable that complicated the reception. I agreed with this reasoning. I stayed home in my apartment on the couch with the specific fatigue of week 13, and I waited. Linda Baxter told my parents in that Thursday meeting what accurate information about stage 2 breast cancer looked like in the context of my specific diagnosis and treatment plan. She told them what the prognosis meant in clinical terms. She told them what chemotherapy was doing to my body and why. She told them that I was doing extremely well given the demands of the treatment. She told them all of the things I had asked Tammy to tell them 12 weeks earlier, in the words I had written on a yellow legal pad. And then she asked them, what had they understood about my illness before this meeting? And they told her. And the things they told her, the vague concerns about choices, the suggestion that stress from lifestyle factors might have contributed, the implication that Tammy was managing a situation I was not being honest about, were enough for Linda Baxter to understand exactly what had been communicated to them, and by whom. She'd named Tammy. She let my parents arrive at that conclusion themselves, which they did, because they are intelligent people who had just received accurate information and could now apply it proactively to the information they had been given and identify where the discrepancies had entered. My mother called me from the parking garage of Banner MD Anderson at 4:30 p.m. on a Thursday while I was on my couch in week 13 of chemotherapy, and she said, "Amber, I need to ask you something. Did she tell us the truth about what was happening to you?" My mother and father arrived at my Phoenix apartment at 6:15 p.m. that Thursday. My mother had clearly been crying in the car. She was composed when she came through the door. Her eyes had the specific redness of someone who had put themselves back together after a hard cry and was doing a competent job of maintaining it. My father was quiet in the way he was always quiet when he was processing something significant. My mother sat on the couch beside me and took my hands, and she said, "Tell me what is actually happening." I told them, from the beginning, the diagnosis, the staging, the treatment plan, the prognosis, the same information I had written on the yellow legal pad 12 weeks ago. I told it to them the way I should have told it to them myself, directly on the Thursday evening of my diagnosis, instead of asking Tammy to be the bridge. My father, who had been quiet throughout, said at the end, "Why didn't you tell us yourself?" "I didn't want to scare you. I thought having Tammy manage the communication would keep the anxiety manageable. I was wrong about that." He nodded. Then he said, "You should always tell us yourself. We are your parents. We can be scared and still be useful to you. But we cannot be useful to you if we have wrong information." He was right. I told him he was right. And I held on to that, the specific, practical wisdom of a father who had had a stroke and had not stopped being capable of wisdom. And I added it to the things I was going to take from this experience. When the experience was over, we talked for 2 hours. My parents stayed for dinner. My mother took over my kitchen in the way of women who have been nurses for 30 years and know the most useful thing to do in most situations is feed someone. And my father sat at my kitchen table and asked about my students and my courses and the things in my life that were not about cancer. He did this deliberately. I understood it as deliberate and as a gift. My mother, before they left, said, "I'm going to call Tammy." She said, "I want you to know what she did, what she told us. I am very angry about that. I want you to know that we see it clearly." Mother called Tammy that Friday morning. I know the content of that conversation because my mother told me about it afterward, in detail, because she is a woman who believes in full disclosure, and because she thought I deserved to know. Tammy's first response was denial. Not aggressive denial, the particular, measured denial of someone who has been caught in something they had believed they could manage, who is now assessing whether denial is a viable position. She said she didn't know where my parents had gotten the impression that she had said things. She said she had been trying to help. She said she had concerned about me in ways that went beyond the medical, and that she had been trying to give our parents context. My mother told her, specifically, what context she had given. My mother is a retired pediatric nurse. She is not someone who can be managed through vagueness. She named specific things she had been told and asked Tammy to explain them. Tammy faced the specific rather than the vague, shifted position. She said she had perhaps been imprecise. She said she had been worried, and that worry sometimes caused her to say things that came out wrong. She said she had been doing her best in a very stressful situation. My mother said, "Your sister has cancer. She is in chemotherapy. She asked you to relay accurate information to us. You told us she was in trouble. You told us her choices contributed to her illness. Those things are not imprecision. Those things are false." Tammy was quiet. Then she said, "I've been really struggling since the divorce. I know that's not an excuse. But I've been struggling and I didn't handle this right, and I'm sorry." My mother said, "I know you've been struggling, and you are going to need to take that up with Amber, not with me. What I need you to understand is that what you did was wrong, and that we know it was wrong, and that we are not going to pretend otherwise." My mother told me this the following Saturday, when she came to Phoenix to take me to my week 14 infusion. She sat in the waiting room while I was in the chair, the waiting room where Tammy had been on the phone 2 weeks, and she was there when I came out. She drove me home. She made tea. I finished treatment in November. The surgery was in January. The radiation ran through March. In April, Dr. Nguyen told me that my scans were clear and that the treatment had been effective and that I was going to be okay in the full sense of the word, not managing ongoing, not waiting for the next scan with my breath held, but okay. The cancer was gone. I was okay. I went back to teaching. I got my hair back. It came in slightly different than it had been before, curlier, which I had been warned about and which I found I did not mind. I called my parents every Sunday myself, directly, without a bridge. Tammy and I have a relationship. I want to be clear about this because the story I have told is not a story about a permanent estrangement. It is a story about a specific and serious harm done during a specific and serious time, and about the slow, imperfect, ongoing work of rebuilding something after that harm. We see each other at family events. We talk occasionally. She has apologized more than once, not always in the ways I needed, but she has apologized. I believe she is genuinely sorry. I also believe the thing she did came from something in her that she has not fully addressed, and I watch for it with the clear eyes of someone who has been through it. My parents are well. My father's garden is thriving. My mother calls me on the first Sunday of every month, in addition to the calls I make. Because she decided after all of this that she wanted an independent line to me, did not run through anyone else. Nurse Deborah does not know that I think about her. I sent a note to her supervisor when the treatment was over. The note said, "She did the right thing." That is all it needed to say. I am 35 years old. I am a college lecturer. I am, by the clean and clinical definition of the word, a cancer survivor. I do not call myself that often, not because it isn't true, but because survivor implies that the defining thing about me is what I survived, and I prefer be defined by what I have built and what I continue to build. What I keep from those 8 months is not the betrayal. The betrayal is real and then the record of it is accurate, and I have not pretended otherwise. What I keep is the specific knowledge of what I am capable of, which is more than I knew before. I kept going through 32 weeks of treatment. I kept teaching. I kept my documentation. I found out what my sister did, and I let the truth arrive without me having to deliver it, which required a degree of patience and trust in other people that I had not previously known I possessed. I keep Nurse Deborah. I keep my father's voice saying, "We can be scared and still be useful to you." I keep my mother in the waiting room where Tammy had been on the phone, present and correct, driving me home, making tea. I keep the yellow legal pad, the one with what I asked Tammy to say in my handwriting. I keep it because it is the document of what I asked for and what was not given, and because accurate documentation is the thing I come back to when I need to know what actually happened. I was losing my hair. She was using my illness to win something. She didn't win. I made it through. That's what I keep. If you stayed until the end, thank you. More than I can say. This story is for everyone who has ever been betrayed at their most vulnerable. When you were sick, when you were scared, when you had nothing left to spend on self-protection, and the person who should have been the bridge was using the bridge to build something for themselves. I want to say something directly. If you are going through something medical, something hard, something that requires you to rely on another person for communication with your family, be careful. Not because most people will do what Tammy did. Most people will not. But your story is yours. Your medical reality is yours. The people who love your accurate information directly from you, if you can give it, and from people you have verified are giving it correctly. Do not hand over the bridge without checking it first. And if you are on the other side of something like this, if you found through the hard thing, I want to know you did it. Whatever the stance is around it, you are on the other side. That is yours and no one can take it. Drop your city in the comments. Tell me if you've been something like this. I read every single one. Subscribe. Hit the bell. Share this. Week 2 continues. More stories. Truth. I'll see you next time.